Hi, and welcome to Just Your Normal Misfit. I'm Ann Thomas, and with me today, I'm very excited because we've been planning this conversation on ADHD for so long. Sonal Singh, who is an ADHD coach and has been practicing for over 6 years as a coach. Sonal, welcome, and thank you so much for the time to be here with me today.
Thank you so much, Anne. I'm delighted to be here. And like you rightly said, we've been planning this for a while. So I'm so happy we are finally making it work.
Sonal, do you want to tell us about how you became an ADHD coach in a world where people don't yet recognize ADHD as a real problem? Could you tell us about your journey there?
Sure, a family member really close to me, and I'm not going to disclose who because it's their story to tell eventually, got diagnosed with ADHD some years ago. This was way back in 2018. And when I was seeking support to help this family member with executive function skills, with management of ADHD, we found that India really had no support available. And that's when I decided that I needed to understand this space a lot more. By then, I was already dipping my feet into child and adolescent mental health, family therapy, and along with doing my other work of running an NGO, a nonprofit in the space of working with vulnerable populations. So it seemed to align well. And so I started studying to be a coach. And interestingly, Anne, what I found was as I started studying ADHD, I found myself in all my manuals. And that naturally led to a diagnosis formally from a psychiatrist well into my 40s. So that's how I became a coach. And of course, I've been practicing as a coach even before my diagnosis, but understanding my own self has really, that lived experience has really made that difference of when I coach people who do have ADHD.
Women are supposed to be the most underdiagnosed segment, and most of them, like you and me, have been diagnosed well into our 40s and suddenly making sense of why certain things were the way they were. And yeah, so it is life-changing to some extent. But do you really think that a label makes all that difference? I'm asked often when I say that I am also diagnosed with ADHD, and how does it make a difference now at 40? How do you respond to that?
Great question. I get asked that question all the time as well, especially by women and even adult men who are considering seeking a diagnosis. Is it worthwhile? There is no right or wrong answer here. It really depends on what you're seeking. For me, when I got my diagnosis, in some ways, it was a validation to understand that my journey as a person with ADHD, with all the ups and downs and all it was really a roller coaster ride, right? Wasn't just because I was flaky or I wasn't clear of what I wanted, all of those things. It really was because there is this element of what ADHD brings, which is there are all these traits and they were active and I didn't understand them. I didn't understand how to harness my ADHD to make it work for me. And by getting that diagnosis, I was able to understand that and I've been able to harness that. I've been able to use my traits to my advantage and my strengths to my advantage. So for me, it's that which is important, that validation. And the second is it allows many people to access medical support, which in other cases you may not be able to. So I have been on medication and medication has been really transformative in my case. It took a while to get to the right space, right medication. And that's not the story for everybody. But in my case, it was really helpful. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is that if you know you have ADHD, sometimes it helps people to understand how to advocate for themselves. Otherwise, you just keep wondering, why do I need to operate or be a certain way when other people don't need that, right? Or they operate in different ways, which is neurotypical. What's wrong with me? So that questioning and that self-belief really isn't present. So this is what the diagnosis really helps you to do, in
Really?
my mind.
Yeah, that's really clarifying. So, in the sense that one is the validation of who you are, two is getting access and opportunities to medication, which is life changing, which can be life changing, even from my experience. And yeah, above all, I think most of us go into this phase of hyper focus, hyper interest, losing it, coming back. These projects that you start and you never end because something else has got your attention by that time, and you keep wondering why is it, and you beat yourself up so much. And I think that making sense, that aha moment, oh, this all makes sense now, right? Yeah, it really helps. So yeah, do you want to tell us what ADHD actually is, since we've just jumped into it without any context? What is
Yeah.
ADHD?
So ADHD is known as, the full form is attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Now there is no such term as ADD. So we have ADHD,
Yeah.
and then there is ADHD inattentive, right? ADHD combined, which is hyperactive and inattentive combined. So this is how ADHD is defined. What I like as a definition for ADHD is that it is a challenge in self-regulation, and which means, like you mentioned, we could be hyper focused or hypo focused. So we can really have very high focus, we can have very low focus. The same thing with energy, the same thing with emotions. Literally anything that you pick up, we struggle to regulate. And to me, that is how ADHD is defined. I also want to say I don't quite agree with it being a disorder, and it's a very controversial sort of debate really that people have. Is it a disorder, not a disorder? And a lot of people with ADHD say it's a disorder. A lot of people will say no. I say that it's a different wiring. And it becomes, of course, a disorder when we don't know how to manage and handle it, and it really impairs our life, which it does for most people with ADHD. But the more we start understanding it, and the more we are able to figure out what helps us, we can understand that it's a different way of being. And it's perfectly valid and acceptable to be different from the neurotypical way of being. So to me, it's a difference more than a disorder.
And would you like to tell us a little about the types that you mentioned? Just take us a little more into details about how one is different from the other. How do you know whether you're combined or inattentive or hyperactive, and how does it impact my life?
So there are three types of ADHD. One is the hyperactive, then there is the inattentive, and there's combined. The way that you would know that is, of course, you could take self-assessments online, but best is to get a diagnosis properly from a psychiatrist and understand where you land. In hyperactive, the stereotypical image is that of a young boy who's jumping around and really struggles to have breaks. So I think it's Dr. Ned Hallowell who says Ferrari mind or a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. And literally that's what comes to mind. The inattentive is usually a lot of girls and women are diagnosed with inattentive ADHD, which is when you're daydreaming, you zone out, you space out. Many times you struggle with energy regulation, all of those things. And combined is, of course, a combination of both of these, right? And my suggestion would be, if you want to understand what sort of ADHD you have or a loved one has, make sure that you're getting a diagnosis for it rather than making your own judgment around it. Sometimes diagnosis is not easy to get to. So yeah, do an online assessment if you need to, but as far as possible, try to get a diagnosis.
But unlike an intelligence test, unlike most other issues that we have, even anxiety, for example, there is a test that you can do and figure where you stand in the scale. ADHD does not have an official diagnosis procedure, right? It's just one of those checklists, and you say how often, how long. So, how does one go about it? Because that's a question that constantly comes in, because ADHD is not diagnosed.
Sure. And especially for adults, that's so much harder because we are conditioned we have been conditioned in our childhood to be a certain way. So when you take these self-assessments online, you really get very confusing results. So I have, on these self-assessments, it's never been clear that I have ADHD. I only figured it out when I started studying it and when I went for a formal diagnosis, right? So absolutely, that's why the self-assessments are questionable. The way to do this is to go for a diagnosis to a doctor and let them, so what the process is, and they will do an observation, they will do a history taking. There are some assessments that are standardized that they will do depending on the psychiatrist and their protocol. And then based on all of this information, they will come up with a diagnosis. Right. And you definitely want to go to an ADHD informed psychiatrist so that they are able to understand the nuances, because many times ADHD overlaps with complex trauma, with anxiety. There are many other factors which makes ADHD difficult to diagnose. And the third is that many psychiatrists will actually tell you that if you've done well academically, there's no way you could have ADHD. So that's why it's really important to go to a well-informed psychiatrist who understands that this is still possible, even if you've done well academically, to have ADHD.
Yeah. And the comorbidities that come with ADHD. Okay, so when we talk about that, it is one of the learning disorders, which doesn't really make sense, because when you look at dyslexia, dysgraphia, it clearly has a problem with a certain element. But ADHD then is put in as a learning disability. Could you explain that to our audience? Why?
So actually, ADHD is not a learning disability. And most places will not refer to it as a learning disability. They will talk of it as an attention disorder. Now, what happens is, if you have ADHD, the chances that you have a learning disability are far higher. Because, and this is all research, right, which will indicate that. The second is, if you have ADHD, the learning process can become much more complex for many people. And yet you will have those who have ADHD and they learn really well, they've done super well academically. All of those things are there. And on the flip side, there are those who are really bright, really smart. And then because they have ADHD, it has really come in the way of their academic performance. So it is a condition which impacts your attention, your focus, your motivation, because there is the whole interest factor, the emotional regulation factor, all of those things. But it's not necessarily considered a learning disability the way dysgraphia is, dyscalculia, dyslexia, all of those different things.
I'm surprised to hear that, because all my research and learning has been that ADHD is one of the markers or considered, because you may of course have dyslexia or dysgraphia alongside, but ADHD in itself, simply because of the challenges it brings in its way, inability to, as you said, motivation, focus, attention, etc. Yeah.
And it's usually clubbed under, so especially in schools and academic spaces, ADHD is clubbed under the special needs. So that's how it gets that lens as well. But it is a attention disorder. So
Sure.
that's what is considered. And then you have your learning disorders.
Okay.
That's the difference between the two.
Okay. And how do you manage two problems at the same time? So you have your attention, lack of motivation, your interest, and all these problems that ADHD gives you. And then you have, on your other hand, probably a dysgraphia, a dyslexia. How do you figure out which is impacting what, and how do you fight or
Yeah.
turn your life around with that?
Such an interesting question, right? And this is why a diagnosis, especially for young people, young children, is so important, because you want to know, along with ADHD, is there something else at play? And normally the support will include both of those things to address, let's say, the dysgraphia. Right now, what is dysgraphia? Dysgraphia is not just that I struggle with handwriting. Dysgraphia also means that when I sit down to write, there is a traffic jam in the brain. So there are these different ways in which dysgraphia shows up. At the same time, when there's ADHD in the mix, now I have to think about my ability to be interested in this particular topic. So if the interest is low, the dysgraphia is just between the two of them, it's this deadly cocktail, right? But if the interest is high and my motivation is high, it's a topic I'm really interested in. If given the right support and structure in terms of the executive function skills and the management, then I'm able to move across from that ADHD sort of stumbling blocks and address the writing given these different contexts. This is why, one, the diagnosis is important. Secondly, the support in school is critically important because you're not just looking at how to help a child write, but you're helping them with their executive function skills, how to sequence, how to plan, how to prioritize, how to break a task, this writing assignment, let's say, into smaller chunks. How do I know what each section is going to contain? All of this is part of executive functioning. And it combines really well with when planning for dysgraphia as well.
Yeah. So how do I train, like executive functioning is something I was coming to. It really messes up with ADHD because you're not able to think about anything in the future, forget plan for it. So how do you train the brain to do it? How do you help your clients go about that?
Yeah. So we work a lot on future thinking, and many folks with ADHD, myself included, I can think of the future in vivid detail, but what I wouldn't do that well is think backwards on how to achieve it. Right. So I am thinking of, I'm here at point A and I'm thinking of getting to point S, let's say, and I can see that in clear detail, but I have no idea or very little idea of how I'm going to get there. And when I start planning from A to B to C, what occurs is that I can't always remember what is the path to S, to that point S. Second, I lose momentum and interest. So what we do is we think about what is the goal I have in mind and work backwards as to what we need to do to get there. So that is the future thinking we think about and we plan for. And that's the executive functioning piece that comes in a big way. And it helps then to manage your ADHD traits around interest and attention, the ability to focus, to not get distracted, because you have very clear understanding of the steps involved and what each step is going to give to me and how do I get it done. So that is the future thinking broken down into pieces. And this is a training that we do repeatedly again and again, whether it's with children and with adults. That how do I think of what I want and then work backwards to see how I'm going to get there, rather than moving from A to S, thinking about S to backwards what I need to get done. So really that way.
So here's a challenge I'm seeing, right? So there's a kid and you know exactly that if you get 95%, you get the subject that you want. I'm just saying boards because they're going on. So 10 boards, you know that 99% or 95%, unrealistic expectation, but fine. If I want to get science with XYZ, whatever that combination that I want, I need to get that. Right, which means that I have backward planned that I need to work on XYZ subjects every day for 2 hours each. That is great. Somebody has sat with me and mapped it out. But now I have to get off the couch and off the television and do that. That's
Yeah.
not happening. And that's what that time blindness, that sense of, okay, time's flying by me, but that motivation to, yes, let's get to it. How do you push that? How do you push that?
It truly depends on every child.
Yeah.
So it's true that for most people who have ADHD or executive functioning challenges, the experience of time is highly compromised. We don't know how to experience time. We live in the now and not now. So even though I know something is important to me, I have the ability to do it, but it is really weeks from now. I just don't sense that urgency at all.
Yeah.
It's a matter of, again, bringing to them what is it that they want? How do they want to achieve it? Right? And a lot of the work is done by the child themselves. It's not me sitting there and planning it for them. Because if I sit and plan for them, they are not really experiencing it and they are not going to do it. So it is about the child and me sitting together and figuring out that if I need, let's say, that 95%, and I have 6 weeks before my exams, then each week, if I was to work backwards, what do I need to do? And we map it out. And then there is scaffolding sometimes that is required to help the child understand how much time they need every time they sit down and work on that particular subject. What is it that they're working on? So we break it down to those minute details as to what are they working on? How do they know that they have understood it, or what else they need to do on it? How do they ask for help? Where do they feel stuck? How do they identify that they are stuck? So we get into those sorts of details as we are working towards a goal, which is a few weeks down the road, because that takes time, and that future thinking is definitely something that's a muscle that is developed. So it's not just because you have planned it that you're going to get there. You're still working on it through those weeks.
Explain scaffolding to our audience. What is that word? It keeps popping up across.
Yeah, so scaffolding is when you create a structure with the child, right? But you are just not leaving the child to it alone. You are creating factors for success and systems for success for the child, right? And sometimes scaffolding can look like asking the child, okay, you have an exam coming up or whatever, this is 6 weeks from now. You've created a plan. Do you know what's coming up for you tomorrow to work on this? So just a simple question like that, asking the child, what is the reminders that you need? Sometimes children are not able to tell you what reminders that they need. So depending on the child, you might actually talk to them and say, okay, so tomorrow this is what you have to work on. Do you want me to remind you? So depending on the child, the scaffolding shifts and changes, and depending on where they are in their journey. But scaffolding is when you're helping the child understand the structure that is set up for them, for their success, and you are helping support it. You're not running it for them. You're not becoming their executive functioning to do it. You're helping them develop their ability to think into the future, to experience time, to break a task down, and you are just supporting from the outside. That is scaffolding.
When it comes to parents, very often the scaffolding merges into becoming the system, right? Like helicopter parents, like you take care of everything so that the child doesn't really build that muscle at all. What would you advise them? How do they go about it?
Yeah, it's tricky as parents, right?
Yeah.
Because as parents, we struggle to, if a child fails or has a setback, perceived failure, it's very hard on parents. So we are conditioned to step in. But here's the thing, for a child who is neurodivergent, all the more reason you actually don't become the executive functioning. You don't plan everything for them, and you let them make mistakes. You let them have their setbacks. You let them have their natural consequences, but within a structure. So in safe places, so that they understand how to address the problem that they have. So one example I'll give you. For example, a child has to sit down and finish homework. Many times the parent will be on the child's case, get it done, get it done, get it done. Instead, you ask the child a couple of times, maybe, that, okay, you have something for the day. What have you brought back? Would you like for me to sit with you and assess what is it that you have to work on? So depending on the child, you might really have to insist, or they will bring their work to you and you ask them, is there any support that you would like to make it happen? Rather than saying, we are going to sit at 7 o'clock and we are going to get it done. Right? Now, what has happened is that you are the one running that entire show, the child hasn't had a chance to really think about what is the homework that they have, how are they going to solve it, how are they going to approach it, how am I going to ask for help? And these are the questions that we can ask the child to help them start thinking, right? And in case the child doesn't get it done, letting them also face the natural consequences, but within a structure in safe ways. And speaking to the school about it as well. That, okay, how do you bring it up with the child to make sure that the child understands that this is something that they do need to submit? Because many times children who are neurodivergent don't consider that as something important. So using the school to your advantage to get that work done. Right. So these are small ways. And at home, it's even easier, the natural consequences. You might have skipped, like the child doesn't come for dinner on time. So therefore, they may not eat dinner one night. And it's okay, especially as an Indian mother, to allow that to happen and not suffer over it and stay up all night. Does that make sense, Anne? Because have you noticed that?
Does it absolutely make sense? But sometimes with what I have learned with the food issues, right? There is no point trying to fight these kids, right? The only way to work with them is to get them on board, like you suggest. So instead of telling them, ask them. It really helps. And like food is a big, big issue at my home in the sense. And if I say you're not eating it this way, fine, I'm okay. I will starve. And that can go. We've tried it. We've tried it up to 5 days of not eating. I'm just not going to eat. And then, but now when things flip in my son's head, for example, it flips.
Hmm.
But for that flip to happen, there is no way on earth that I can make it happen or somebody else can make it happen. It has to happen within themselves.
You
And
have to be able to wait it out.
yeah. And for me, the biggest pressure or challenge as a parent of somebody who has ADHD, as well as somebody with ADHD, is the need for structure to be able be able to perform the same things in a certain way, this in that proper structure. It's a big challenge for me. And to make sure somebody else is doing it. I'm just about taking care of myself. I've managed my work, and 5 reminders in, I am like, okay, this is not happening. What works? What doesn't work? So it's very frustrating because not only you keep the rhythm, you have to keep the rhythm for somebody else. That for me is very, very challenging. Yeah,
Yeah, I think you bring up such a great point. So it's not just that you're managing your own ADHD, but you're parenting
correct.
with ADHD of a child who might also have ADHD or be neurodivergent in some way. And that's again, it takes a lot,
Correct.
right? Because you are managing your own executive functioning, your own ADHD traits, and you're having to build structure, which may not come as naturally to you in any case. And this is where I get a lot of flack for this, but I strongly have seen a lot of, again, positives here when parents actually are able to create flexible structures, not rigid structures. So sometimes when you yourself have ADHD, you struggle with bringing flexibility into your structure because outcomes are so important.
Important.
And what that does is it then creates this effect with the child where the child starts to resist and push back. And as much as they love structure, they will fight back to what they perceive as your structure.
Correct.
And you're still not helping them build their executive functioning. That's the other outcome.
Yeah.
So it's very important as a parent to be able to say, this is the broad structure. Dinner is going to be at X or Y time. On a Sunday, we can plan for what is going to be on the menu for the rest of the week, and you can give your inputs. If you choose not to give inputs, then dinner will be, or whatever meal times will be planned the way I see fit. That's natural consequence one.
Correct.
And the dinner is going to be at X or Y, Z time. If you choose not to come for dinner, then you're on your own.
Yeah.
You have to then figure out how else you're going to satisfy those hunger cravings with healthy food, because in my home, at least, we've done this, that we try not to have sugary foods and snacks, etc. There's only healthy food. Now, either you get cooked hot meals, or then you have to have a sandwich or something which is going to be something you'll have to make yourself. And ultimately, children also figure out that there's much more effort required in one thing versus another. And like you rightly said, it takes a few days to flip that switch. But once
Yeah.
they realize that you're not going to budge on it and they have a role that they can play, they will come around.
Yeah. I think the biggest changing point for me was just to set those boundaries, right? That what is it that you can do as a parent and what is it that you will not do at the cost
Yep.
of you, right? So in sometimes the line between scaffolding and supporting just gets so hazy, and then you allow for a lot of things at your cost as a parent, right? So for me it's like, for example, just yesterday he was watching and he was playing a game, and I do now know that switching from one task to the other is impossible. You cannot expect a child to say, shut, let's go, right? With ADHD. That's never going to work out. Now, that's learning as a parent over years of reading. But most parents will wonder, what is the problem in sense, shut it and let's move on. They need that time. So for me, it is like 15 minutes from now. Okay, you need to shut it down by this time. This is your second reminder. And before you come back for the third time, you're surprised that it's already done, right? Because the same person, if you're trying to do it, it'll be a fight. It will be a maniacal fight, because there are a lot of people who don't understand that reminder that has to come in. So,
How you build the transitions, and the reminders also have to come in a certain way.
correct.
You rightly said, it's not that you say 2 minutes or 5 minutes before. You actually have a lead up to it, because transitions aren't easy. Even
Correct.
as adults, transitions aren't easy. And we have our own ways of transitioning from one thing to another, especially if it is something much more boring or takes a lot more mental energy. And
Yeah.
children experience the same thing, but as adults, we don't necessarily give them that space.
Yeah.
With all children, but especially children who are neurodivergent, who need a lot more transition time.
Correct.
So one of the things that I suggest, Anne, is again giving the reminder, but even before that or adding to that, asking the child that, okay, you are now playing, by when will you be done? And how will you know that you will be done? So really bringing in the questions a lot more, because we again want to transfer the thinking work to them. And
Actually,
it's not
yeah.
going to work immediately, but over a period of time, you will see that they will start thinking, and they themselves will come back and say, okay, I'm going to sit and do this for 45 minutes, and it'll be, or maybe for one game, and then I'll be done.
So the hope is always that things switch. Like I remember one year taking through just the whole process of going to school and packing three different boxes was a big challenge, right? To switching to the boy gets up on his own time, leaves without. I just decided I will not wake up. School is your need, it's not my need. You're going to decide if you want to go, please go. Otherwise, I'm happy and I'm sleeping in, right? Because I'm not getting punished for you to go to school. And it might have been led up for whatever reasons, but that was my boundary that it's on you now. It's the other way. And things change and it's possible sometimes. It's not possible all the time. But yeah, sometimes you just have to let things go.
It depends also on what it is, right? And
Yeah,
how much
correct,
the child is interested in it. So
correct.
not
I
going to
know that he wants to go to school. So it worked. I know he wants to go to school. If it's on something else, he might just say, oh, good for me. I'm going to sleep.
exactly.
Yeah.
But in this case, he knows he wants to, and he knows he wants to go to school. School is important.
Yeah,
He
and
has,
he knows I have pulled out the younger one. I did never send him to school as a, so this is very much possible with me. It's not going to be one of those situations my mother's throwing a threat and it's not going to turn up. So yeah, it really helps that way. So what are these few tools that you can help? Like timers really work, right? Alexa has been life-changing for us.
yeah.
Yeah, so some things that you recommend for children and adults with the ADHD.
So I always recommend, instead of using digital timers, to think about using analog clocks. or the time timer. This is an example here, right? Why I like this is because you can actually see time moving.
Yeah.
And most of us don't experience time. We know how to read time, but we don't experience time. So when we can see the clock move is when we know how time is passing and how time is moving.
I can feel anxious at that. I can just feel the
Yeah.
anxiety build. The moment I see time slipping away, it would build so much anxiety in my head. So I'm
For
just
some
wondering.
people, for some people that's true.
Yeah.
And then in that case, maybe you want to think about maybe a clock doesn't work for you, but a time timer, and using it, building your muscle with doing it for very small, simple
Yeah.
tasks, right? Using a sand timer or a water
Yeah.
timer, those things are calming. And again, starting small, not for big things, right? So when you know that, okay, I just have to brush my teeth and I'm in no urgency to do this, right? So I might set up a 2-minute sort of sand timer
That
or
time.
time timers, and I can take my time. I'm not stressing about it because we are also reconditioning the brain to not get stressed by time.
Yeah.
Why that happens, Anne, is because as kids, we have gone through this torture of seeing the clock move and being
Correct.
told, come on, come on, come on,
Come
you're running.
on.
And
Yeah, and you're always running behind time on something. So now you're so paranoid about deadlines and meeting time that,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that's the conditioning. What we want to do is rewire and recondition that this is just that so that I can see how time is moving. It's not to create pressure. And then there are ways of also seeing that, okay, if I have allocated, let's say, 25 minutes to something, can I check in halfway through that time at around the 12-minute mark to see where I am? How am I doing? And if I'm on track. And that then also helps me reduce that anxiety when I come to the 25-minute mark because I know how time is moving, what I'm doing. It helps to bring the focus and attention back. And for all of these things, rather than using an alarm clock or a digital timer, I again recommend using a time timer or on an analog clock using post-it notes or those little flags to indicate where time is so that you can come back and see it, right? These prompts that are not going to cause you to go into fight or flight. Very calm and easy. So this is one tool that I will always recommend. The second is having fidget toys, right? And quiet fidget toys. So I always have around me a lot of things. So on my desk, I'll keep little things like these, which I sometimes just need that sensory input. And it allows me to think. It allows me to regulate because what is ADHD? It's a challenge in regulation, right? So now it can help me regulate my emotions. It can help me regulate my energy. It can help me regulate my attention, anything really that I'm working on or bringing myself back to, right? So I always recommend quiet fidget toys like this, blue tack, which children love, absolutely love to play with. And I always encourage teachers in school, let them have it. Why not? Another thing that I really like are pencils that have little bit of some texture to them, right? Because anytime there is texture, it helps us again to come to that point of being able to focus. Some people like to roll paper, right? So all of these things are totally fine to do. Doodling, if doodling helps you think. One other tool that I recommend for everybody with ADHD or anybody who's neurodivergent to think about is really consider what is the way that you process information, not how you learn, but how you process information. Why that is important is once you figure out that, okay, my way of processing information is not just that I need to verbalize it as I'm speaking it out, I'm processing it, but I also need to ask questions. And when I ask questions, it helps me to connect the dots, put the puzzle pieces together, and that helps me in recalling it. It helps me in explaining it better. I can then articulate much better what I want to say or where this fact sits in my brain, right? So this is the other tool I strongly recommend, because many of us struggle with working memory and we struggle with remembering facts and details and all of those things. But once we understand how we process information, then we are able to actually draw this back much easier. So these are 2, 3 tools that we certainly work on with almost every client of mine.
For me, I figured that if I have a few colors, words or a pen and a paper, it just helps me process. Because for me, if I'm in a session and I have to keep moving my hands, right? I have to doodle, I have to write something, I have to make something, because that's the only way I can pay attention to you. And I'm completely focused. I'm not looking at you, but I'm completely focused on what you're saying. Because this whole process, even in the podcast, where I have to sit and listen to you, another person speaking, and this is something I'm very, very interested in. But for me to pay complete, I can feel my feet go fidget, 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 fidget,
Wow.
because it takes all my regulation where I have
Exactly.
to look normal. I'm masking in whichever way. So this is the process that we follow. So I really helps me to just use
Yeah.
color, use.
So your style is a visual style of processing information. You said colors, and like you might make notes and you might draw shapes around them. You might use different colors around them. And all of these are ways in which you will focus your attention, but also how you will recall different pieces of information. And so there are so many processing styles. There are gazillion, but really some of the ones that are most common are the verbal, visual, kinesthetic, which is moving.
Movement. Yeah.
Yeah. And then these are also sometimes in the learning styles, of course. But then there is the conceptual where you're asking questions, right? There is like you might have music that you might listen to, and that helps you process information. So there's intuition where you intuitively understand how the dots connect, and that's what really helps you recall information. And then there's emotional, where there's a really strong positive emotion attached to a piece of information, and that helps you recall it. And for each person, their processing styles are different. But it's very important to understand what helps and works for you.
And it's very important to actually try these different styles and to figure out
Yeah.
which is yours or what combination works for you. And it comes sometimes just having good music around really helps you calm down and set up for work. Sometimes it's just good smells, right? You just set up your food thing and it, or just having flowers around or something, whichever just gives your body a moment to regulate and calm down and emotionally connect to what you're going to do today, because we don't do anything in between, right? It's either hypo or hyper.
I've noticed if we do anything in between, most of us find that, as the term I use is, languishing. We are neither here nor there. We don't like it at all.
Yeah, like it's so mundane. What is the point of it all,
That's
right?
the
So,
point of it all.
oh
And
no.
that's what we all aspire towards, by the way.
Yeah.
Every client of mine will say, why do I have to be in hyper or hypo? Why can't I just coast? But the coasting is so difficult.
Yeah.
None of us
Like
want it.
punishment. It's like one day of just you're not changing the world today. Okay, what's the point of life, right? You want to change the world every single day.
Or recover from changing the world.
Changing the world, or not,
Sleeping.
or just go under with a book and disappear and not meet a single person and then beat yourself up because you did not do anything valuable or
So-called valuable, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
we don't give credit to how much our bodies and our brains need that quiet time to recover,
correct.
and how important that is. That too is productive.
Yeah, the definition of productive that we have been conditioned with really needs to have shifted a lot. Just rest itself is the most productive thing you can do for your body. But so I was telling my mom, I slept all of yesterday. I did nothing. I gave myself the whole afternoon and I slept. And she said, is everything all right? I said, no, everything is all right. I wanted to just sleep and rest, and I was not going to beat myself about it. That itself is a big win for me. Yeah.
It's interesting how much guilt and shame we carry for doing simple things for ourselves, which
Yeah.
we consider as unproductive, or we've gotten conditioned to the fact that those are not okay to do.
Those are not changing the world.
Those are not changing the world.
Yeah. What are the most common biases or myths that come around ADHD that you'd like to clarify?
There are so many, but the most common one, that ADHD affects boys and not girls.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Right? It's the most common one. And now we know that that is absolutely not true. And linked to that is that ADHD is a condition that affects children and not adults. So I've actually worked or had these conversations with psychiatrists who I actually appreciate a lot, who told me that when they were studying and through their learning journey, ADHD was not something that affected adults. And one of them actually said, when I get an adult with ADHD, I don't do the diagnosis because I'm not equipped for it, but I will refer them to someone who I know is equipped to understand the nuances of how ADHD might show up in an adult and especially in an adult woman. But those are your very rare specialists and doctors. But the general myth is that ADHD doesn't affect adults and especially not women. One other one that I alluded to earlier is that if you've done well academically, there's no way you would have had ADHD. This one I hear all the time, even today, and I hear it from doctors as well. I hear it from of everybody around in this field who will say ADHD, if you've had ADHD, that means your education was definitely affected and compromised. But that is not true. Now research will show you that there are many people who did extremely well in school, even in college. It's when they got into the working world that suddenly things started to go out of hand. And that's when they got diagnosed and they figured out ADHD had been so much at play. It's just that when they were in school and college or college, they probably had subjects of interest. They were high achievers. They had different motivations. There was a lot of scaffolding. There were structures that worked for them. So there
So,
could be many reasons.
yeah, also schooling is it's like a formula, right? If you learn the formula, which it took me a while, right? That you have these questions. If you figure the way a mnemonic or something, and you figure an answer, and you put X number of words, by the time you CBSE also give it. So with CBSE, it was so simple. If you have that structure in place, then you can score good marks. Scoring good marks was never a problem because you just need to learn that formula of how to answer the question. So that itself can be a challenge and a motivation.
And that's the thing, our generation, and we had so much structure anyway, right?
Correct.
Had no way to really not deal
Do
with it.
well.
Like we had to work with that structure.
Correct.
Not working with that structure was not an option.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you managed whatever you needed to
And our
manage.
generation, a 70 was decent, by the way. Yeah, a 70 or an 80 was decent. You're not expecting
Absolutely.
100% from the students. And we didn't have social media to that extent. We didn't have so many distractors, which makes
Yeah,
life so
exactly.
difficult.
When I think of my distractors, I was not a great student for a large part of my academic career. And then suddenly I was a fantastic student. But I remember my distractions were encyclopedias because what else was there? There was no TV, there was no social media. And if I wanted to be distracted, I wanted
No,
to
I
get
had Santa Barbara.
history.
I had Santa Barbara.
Yeah, eventually.
Eventually, yes.
Eventually, but not when we were like little kids. We
I completely
had
agree.
Chitrahar, like that was it.
Yeah. And Vyomkesh Bakshi. I
Exactly.
still
But there were
remember.
those little.
But we had we were very hard on structure. I think as even our families, they were very high structure that 5 to 7, whether you like it, whether you don't, you are seated. You have to sit. Now, whether you sit and you fidget or you write or you don't, at the end of the day, you're going to read something.
And
But I I have not been able to do that.
no, I think we are very different as parents as well
Right.
now.
Yeah.
because we certainly didn't want to put our children through what we went through.
Yeah.
And also, our children are not the kind of children we were. We are not educating them the way we got educated either. We want them to be independent thinkers. We want them to be able to decide and figure out what is good for them, not good for them, what they want to do, not want to do. We weren't given those choices. We had to do what was expected.
My friend and I were talking, and I was talking about how we've always given the freedom of choice, right, at home, in terms of, is this what you want to do? Is this not what you want to do? Like even Zachary, whether he goes to school or not. So you want free thinkers at home, but free thinkers are going to come and bite you constantly because they're not going to fall in line when you want them to fall in line. When there are five guests around, they will shoot their mouths. They will say the embarrassing things. Free thinking is a great idea, but it will come and bite you, and you have to be prepared for that and accept that that's what you're raising. So
Exactly. As parents, we are now having to really manage our own expectations and realize this is what was important to me, and therefore I have to be comfortable with it. Even if the world around me sometimes is, what are you saying? What are you doing? But this is not how it works. I see a lot of parents who want the free thinkers in certain structures,
it doesn't
right?
work like that. How
It
does
doesn't work like that.
yeah.
That's the
I
beauty
will
of
eat every vegetable that you ask me to. I will eat whatever is put in front of you. I will not ask a question, but I want to be a free thinker.
yeah. How does that
Um,
work?
please tell me. I'd like it to work. I would like to know.
You
No.
don't want to be asked those questions and the rebelliousness to show up. But
Yeah.
honestly, that's what it is. The questions are going to come back, and this is what we have nurtured and want to nurture. At least I feel that's important.
Absolutely. And as long as we can be patient and breathe through those patches and hold in our anxiety of our expectations, I think we should be all right. That's the hope.
That's the
We hope.
hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would change if I'm also looking at the clock, but what would change if I were to come to you? What could I expect working with a coach, an ADHD coach? What should I realistically expect? What is the duration for something to flip?
Yeah.
Anything on that?
Yeah. So when it comes to adults with ADHD, when they come to me, they usually will come to me for a range of things. Somebody is working on their PhD, somebody is an entrepreneur, somebody is a leader in a company, and they are transitioning from one role to another, or it could be a host of things. It could be a mom, a young mother, or not a young mother. It could be anybody really. And what we do is we work on identifying your ADHD traits in the way that they show up for you. We look at what are your strengths, because interestingly, and most of us don't know what our strengths are. And these I'm talking about not performance strengths, but character strengths. Really strengths that make us tick, right? And we don't know what they are. And when that recognition and realization comes, it's a transformational piece at that time to see how people use it in their lives and how much it makes an impact to their executive functioning and their ability to manage their ADHD traits. And then from there on, we think about, okay, goals that this person has for the next 3 to 6 months. We think about what is the reason for these goals, what makes it important to achieve these goals for this particular person. And what we are trying to do in this process is really move from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. So, what inside me is triggering me to achieve this goal versus that I should do it because it's expected of me, right? So we make that shift take place. And then each session, what people do is that they will bring real life problems to the conversation that they are dealing with. It could be anything really. It could be that I don't get my to-do list done day on day and it's been pending for weeks and months. It could be as simple as there are these difficult conversations or emails I need to write, and every time I have to write them, I go into paralysis. It could be really anything that they would bring to the table. aligned to the goals that they have, the broader goals. And we would look at how their ADHD is coming in the way, what is the outcome they want, how can they use their strengths as a lens to now start solving. And we co-create the solutions in terms of the systems, the structures, the tools, the strategies. Most importantly, how do I implement this? Right? Because we all can figure out plans, but we struggle to implement those plans. And how do I build a plan B and a plan C? Because no plan can exist in absolute. It needs to be, we need to be able to tweak it. So this is how each coaching session runs. And usually you want to invest in about 12 sessions to start seeing sustainable shifts taking place. We are talking about years and years of conditioning, coping mechanisms, and strategies that have been in place, which are not working anymore. And this unlearning and relearning takes some time.
How is it very different from a therapy session? If somebody were to ask you that question, how is it different from a work-related executive coaching or something very intimate, which is therapy? How do you explain that?
In therapy, we look a lot, in therapy, you would go into a lot around the past and the factors that have gotten you there. And the therapist gives a lot of, again, input as to what is the reasoning for it and what they can do about it, etc., etc. But they spend a lot of time threading through what are the causes and factors. In coaching, we look at the causes and factors from a information or from an understanding point of view, and then we go into a creation mode of solution, and it's a co-created solution. It's not me as a coach telling you what to do, because we both know that if I tell you what to do, chances are you are either not going to do it at all, or if you do it, you're going to do it for a short period of time because it's not come from that inner knowing. You're just doing it because I've told you to do it. And if it works for some time, it's fine. But otherwise, it's not even going to work for that long because it's not coming from that inner knowing.
Yeah.
So this is the difference in coaching, that we co-create the outcomes, we co-create that awareness, and that's what leads to the action.
When it comes to you, how do you function? Are you your own coach or do you look out to somebody else?
I certainly have my own coach.
Okay.
You know what they say, that
The
if you
therapist must have their own therapist.
therapist, then a coach must have their
Have
own
their own
coach as well. So I absolutely have my own coach.
Okay.
And of course, I coach myself as well, because when you are in this space, you learn to start observing and noticing. And that's really helpful. And you know what they say? Every time I have a coaching session, my client is reflecting something back to me. Right now, the session is about my client and it remains for my client. But when I walk away from that session, I also take away something that is for me.
Yeah.
So this is a constant evolution.
Yeah. And in terms of coping strategies, how have you seen, has it worked? Because you have so many of these gender related conversations that come in. And is it easier for women to switch and to work with women, or is it more challenging because they're in their own heads most of their time? What have you felt about it?
I work with a lot of women, and most of the time, women will tell me how this is the first time in their lives that they felt really heard and seen. And we are able to understand what those emotions are that somebody is experiencing, because as an Indian woman, I get it, the conditioning I get. So they don't have to go into as much detail to explain why or what something exists, which otherwise they feel many times with a man, they're not really seen and heard in the same way, right? There's that element of feeling defensive. that I'm having to explain it, and it almost makes me feel guilty. So that is one feedback that I get continuously. In terms of the coping strategies and mechanisms, it works like it would work with any client. Each client's journey is different. There are some clients who will really tap into the process, and within 6, 8 sessions, they start seeing big shifts. There are some clients who need many more sessions. And from a gender perspective, that's true as well.
Okay.
It could be either way.
Okay. So you haven't seen the kind of statements that we see, like there's so many myths around gender and ADHD. So that's why I asked this question, that if there is a problem, it's not like it's harder on women or harder on men or easier on women or easier. Everybody's dealing with their own challenges and their own problems, and each one is figuring out their own path through it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really believe in intersectionality. So you can have ADHD, you can be a man with ADHD, you can be a middle child who's a man with ADHD. There are so many complexities. And the same thing with women as well.
Yeah.
So you can be a, let's say, a human with ADHD, and then you can be a woman with ADHD. You can be a woman who comes from a certain context, like from, let's say, an urban space versus a rural space, or a tier 2, tier 3 city. So there are all these intersectionalities that come into play. So it's hard to say that, okay, women from this particular group will have it, or women have it harder than men, because it truly depends. There are men who might come from tier C cities who might have it a lot harder than women who come from tier A cities.
Right.
So I usually, don't put it in those black and white terms. It truly
Yeah.
depends on what you as a client is experiencing, and then how we work through that journey together.
Okay. Another question that I had in terms of children, how early do you think we should start helping them build these executive functions and training them? And how do you train the trainer to help them with these?
Yeah. So children with ADHD actually don't usually get diagnosed before the age of 6 or 7.
Correct.
That's the first thing. But when it comes to executive function skills, you can pretty much start teaching children executive function skills from the time that they're toddlers. Right? Because what are executive function skills? They are your managing your responses, your impulsivity, building your ability to get started on a task, managing your interest, experiencing time. And it's age appropriate at all of those levels, right? So you can literally start doing it from the time that they are little. There are certain school systems which are very experiential that do it very well with children to help them build their executive function skills. In terms of training people, there are occupational therapists, speech and language specialists who do a good job of managing executive function skills, depending on whether you found the right person. When I am working with specialists or with people who are in these spaces, we work a lot around what do executive function skills mean in terms of the context of children, especially in school settings, for parents to really understand how executive function skills work. We work a lot around helping these specialists think about future thinking, because many of them don't know what future thinking is. In India, I'm talking about, right? So these are the kind of skills that we work on. So not everybody understands what executive function skills are. Unfortunately, we are really very far away from having that common understanding across the board.
I was very surprised that in one of the myths, it didn't come up that ADHD does not exist, because a lot of the communities that I work with,
I didn't bring it up because it didn't come into my mind, but absolutely, that's a big
the
myth.
first one, right? That these are just made up stories. We didn't have it in our times. Now you guys have all these special problems. So,
Yeah, this is a very common one. What is ADHD? Or one other one is everybody has ADHD.
yeah,
So
yeah,
they
I also
both,
have ADHD. Yeah.
that everybody has ADHD, or there is no such thing as ADHD. It's just you people indulge yourself too much.
Correct.
So yeah, both of those are myths
Yeah.
as well.
Before we wrap up, I'll just quickly, one more thing in terms of emotions. I think ADHD deals a lot in terms of, as you said, regulation. And most of all, because motivation is intrinsic, right? Whether or not you match up to a task is something where you fail. It's very personal. But when it comes to emotion, it's always out there and it's always impacting a relationship, right? In the sense, how you respond to a question, whether you break out into tears very easily, or whether you get angry and upset very easily, whether you're able to regulate that emotion in a conversation. I think it impacts a relationship a lot more, whether it's parent child, whether it's a partner, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a group, whether it's making friends, which is why you will have a lot of ADHD kids who are loners. So do you want to talk to us about how to work on emotions?
So emotions is definitely has an impact on relationships, but emotions actually are they're your foundation in terms of executive functioning, right? So anything and everything that you do is related to emotions. Whether I decide to get up and brush my teeth in the morning, first thing when I wake up, or I take some time, it's all related to emotions. Interactions, 100%. How I respond. Most of us don't respond, we react, right? It's literally whatever is the input, and then therefore I'm going to have a reaction to it. Emotional regulation is a big part of the ADHD coaching work, and it's at the foundation. And we begin with being able to understand and expand our emotional vocabulary. That is the very first thing. So when I say I'm angry, it is not really giving me much information about what is going on, versus if I say I'm angry, but really what I'm feeling is excluded and isolated. Now that really tells me what is happening. And the more I'm able to use that kind of language where it's expanded from just anger, sadness, fear, excited, I'm able to then understand that particular emotion that I'm feeling, what is happening, what is the cause of it, is it real, is it coming from my past experiences, or is it really from this particular moment? And now what do I want to do about it, which is a positive action, right? And teaching that tool and can be again transformational for most people, because most of us don't know this emotional language, and we don't even know where to feel it in our body. Most of us live in this place where the emotions are, if we feel uncomfortable emotions, we compartmentalize them, and we operate in fight and flight because we've compartmentalized them, and we are just in this reactive state. We don't know where we are feeling it in our body, and we carry lots and lots of stress. So you'll see even children with ADHD will carry this reactivity with them. The more we work on this emotional language, the reactivity decreases, their ability to sense from just their body the emotions that they're experiencing then informs them how they want to respond in a situation, whether it's with friends, whether it's with family members, whether it's with a task that they need to do, which is not of interest. And by the way, interest in the ADHD world that I am in, interest is an emotion, right? Boredom is an emotion. And if you speak to a child about this, they will tell you, I feel boredom like this in my body. And I feel interest like that in my body, the same way that I feel jealousy a certain way in my body. So this is the kind of nuance and language we try to build so that children then, and adults as well, are able to figure out how to navigate difficult feelings and move into a space of more optimal executive functioning.
Yeah. Another big challenge that we have is rejection sensitivity, right? We feel it harder. A no that I would say to a neurotypical versus a no, or why do you have to an ADHD person. It's read so differently, intentionally, unintentionally, right? Whether I am on the other side or whether I'm on the giving side. How do we work on that?
Yeah, RST is an interesting one. It takes a long time.
Yeah.
First thing, where we look at a lot around emotional regulation, around these notions of black and white thinking, right? And really building an understanding of being able to do a pattern interrupt when the brain goes into that spiral. So
Vital.
asking, is this real? Most Many of us don't see, we are not able to distinguish that what we perceive as criticism may not be criticism, it's just a comment, observation, feedback, which would be very plain, right? But we perceive it, and a lot of it comes as a trauma response as well, because there's this whole statistic that children with ADHD have heard 20,000 more negative messages by the age of 12 than neurotypical children. So we perceive things in a much more intense way because that has been the conditioning, and it takes a while to do that interruption.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a real thing. Many people who struggle with that kind of criticism have a sense they will not take risks. They have a very high fear of failure. They will not want to engage in many conversations. They may not want to engage in things that put them at risk outside. So there is a lot that goes on that really hinders life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the statistics on the well-being of kids who have grown up with ADHD is also not looking very good. Depression, 1 in 3 kids, anxiety, 1 in 4. The numbers are not looking that good. So the faster we recognize it and the faster we are able to help them or give them the tools to cope with these challenges. Needs many more Sonals in India today. What can we do about that?
Absolutely. Getting the word out. We need coaches who are trained coaches. So there are lots of people who want to become ADHD coaches, and they feel if they've studied ADHD for 6 weeks, they're ready to be coaches. But no, it takes a while to understand what this is, to understand the nuances. So spend time when you really want to help address something in a way that it's going to transform lives, impact lives, then you have to give it that space. So that would be my one thought. And the other is, in the meanwhile, be allies. We need a lot of allies. And how do you be an ally? By being able to not discount somebody's experience with their ADHD, right? So some of the things that we were talking about, and where people will say, okay, you're saying you have ADHD, but everybody has ADHD. I also do this, or there's no such thing as ADHD, right? So let's just give that space to people that you can have an experience of your life and your journey, which doesn't need opinions from you as to why they may not be real. Because the more people feel heard, seen, validated, the more empowered they become to actually handle their challenges and move ahead with that positivity that, okay, I can solve for this. Otherwise, it's just questioning, okay, maybe it's all in my mind. Maybe I am not really, like, I'm just making up all of these things, and they are constantly in that flux.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to victim shame. It's very easy to victim blame. But rather than doing that, just to hold space for them and allow people to emote, to speak up, to share their experiences, I think that matters a lot. And yeah, we do need a lot more of allies, as you say. If somebody had to become a coach, what would their training require, Sonal?
As of now, India doesn't have ADHD coaching training available. So most of the training that is there is available in the US. And my strong suggestion is, if you do want to become an ADHD coach, look at training programs that are accredited by ICF. If it's a non-ICF program, I would not recommend it because we don't know how well they have actually managed the different components of it and how evidenced it is. But ICF programs have gone through a certain rigor. So that would be my recommendation. Go through that and then and also know that if you're going to be a coach for people with ADHD, what is your motivation to do that? Most of us come with a certain motivation, and it needs to be clear in your mind, why do you want to do this? Because you're talking about working with people who need a certain safety from you, and are you going to be able to give them that safety?
Very well said. Yeah, it really is very important because if I was to look at a therapist, for example, today, when I look online and there is everybody who's offering counseling services, and it breaks my heart because it is not about just giving good advice, right? It's about holding space for somebody's emotions, trauma, experiences, and to help them build up through that, right? In the same way, ADHD is such a complex process and a lived experience because we've constantly berated ourselves, we've constantly written ourselves away. And as you said, 20,000 negative comments more by the age of 12. And that's just the average. In our society, in our environment, and from our experiences, we know that it's far, far more, right? This is a person who's questioning every cell of their being, right? Am I good enough? Should I be here? Why should somebody listen to me? Should I speak up? Who'll be saying all the wrong things in their defenses just because they haven't figured how to regulate their emotion, how to regulate what they're feeling. So kindness matters a lot. And Sonal, it's been really, really helpful to just listen to you. And I'm sure there will be lots of people who would want to have you as their coach. Are there any details that you would like to share with the audience? Please feel free. How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, my website is sonalsinghcoaching.com. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Instagram. So if you do a search, ADHD Coach Sonal Singh, you'll find me. And yeah, reach out. I do one-to-one coaching, there is group coaching, and there are lots and lots of different opportunities for us to connect on. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this time with you.
Thank you so much, Anne. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate the space to come out and talk about ADHD. Thank you.
Thank you.